Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be going through some of the logo making capabilities in the Forza Motorsport and Forza Horizon paint maker. So to get started with this one, what we're going to do is we're going to create a framework. You can see in the upper right hand corner I've got in the clipboard a little green line. What we're going to do with that is we're going to start creating a frame for this. So the next few steps will be showing the process of making the Lowe's logo, Lowe's Home Improvement Stores. And so what I've done is I found a PNG on a gridded background. What that lets you do is that lets you measure your parameters in something concrete rather than having to guess. And so we use these boundary markers to kind of set our edges and get our proportions right. It's not always an exact science. Sometimes you get like funky half boxes. This is one that does have some funky half boxes, and you'll see at the end that I have to make some changes to this to make it look right. But you're just using this as a baseline to get started, and it's something that can really help you sort of begin to understand like how to build shapes and how to make sure that things are centered, how to make sure that things are proportioned. As you get better with this tool, you probably won't need these anymore, but I like them as a starting point. And right here I've just put in the center one because the Lowe's logo has a peak in the middle of it, so we need to be able to make sure that that's centered. And so we started with the center line here, and now based on the squares on the PNG that I found, we're counting out in either direction to get the width set. Now that we're setting the right side here, we're going to lock that into place. And now what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this 90 degrees. And now we're going to set our bottom and our top parameters so that we can get the height of this logo correct. Now I'm setting the bottom right on an even line here because this is a place where I get to decide where the line goes. So I'm setting this right on the bottom just so that it's easy to see. I can see the black line right above it. That's the line that our logo is going to sit on. So I'm just making this so that it covers the entire width so that we can make sure that everything lines up all the way across. We're gonna lock that into place, and then we're gonna move to the top bar. Once again, as you're doing this, it's important to always count and recount the number of squares on your PNG file. It can be tricky sometimes to get them exactly right. A lot of times they're pretty small and kind of difficult to zoom in on. So we've just taken the time here to double check and recount these a few times, just to make sure that you've got your top parameter where it needs to be. You don't want to be way off with your counting because that's going to throw off everything you do. If you're a little off, it's okay. Just make visual notes. And the good part about doing this is you're going to stare at this logo for so long that when you do get to the end, if you notice anything that's a little funky, you're going to be able to notice it and you're going to be able to make those adjustments. But by making sure that we're meticulous in the beginning, it makes it so that the adjustments we have to make at the end aren't as drastic and they don't take as long to make. Now, since we're making the Lowe's logo, this is a 3-step sort of shape that we have to build here. There's the rectangle at the bottom, there's a little kick out, and then there's the final peak at the top. And all three of those need their own height bars, just so that you make sure that you're getting each section of this right. And again, doing this is how we make sure that when we do make a mistake, if we do find something that's wrong later, it's easier to fix because we know A and B are okay, we need to fix C. Or we at least know that A is okay and we only need to fix C, and we don't throw off the proportions of the entire thing. Finally here, we're about to create the third and final stick for the top parameter of the Lowe's logo. This is going to be the one that's the absolute top, that's the top of the triangle that forms the peak. So we're gonna pop that in based on the counting of our PNG. And once we lock that in, we'll be ready to start building the actual shape. So now here we go. We're going to start with this simple rectangle. We're going to want to change the color to something that's contrasting with the green. I'm not going to go with the blue just yet. I'm going to go with the black No real rhyme or reason for that. You could go with the blue if you wanted to. You could make this whatever color you wanted as long as it is easy to see against your green border lines. So now that I've got the width just about perfect, we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to changing the height. Obviously, we're going to have to shuffle this around a little bit, but since you've got the parameters right here already lined up, all you got to do is make sure that all four sides line up, and once you get that all set, you can lock it in and move on. Now we're moving on to the second tier. One thing I forgot to do, I'm realizing right now, is I forgot to count how far in to step the second layer of this. So I'm just going to eyeball it for now, and with the understanding that I'm probably going to have to fix it a little bit later. But yeah, we're just going to eyeball it for now. That doesn't quite look like enough. I think we might need to move in a little bit farther. Maybe about here. Okay, somewhere in here looks goodish. I'm going to go a little bit farther just to make sure that it's really. I'd rather go too far now and then have to widen it out later. But now that's all set, and now we can move on to adding the triangle shape that's going to form the peak. I'm grabbing the equilateral triangle because this is a symmetrical design. Obviously, you want both sides to be the same. So this makes it easy. You get the triangle, you get the peak of the triangle right on that right where those two lines cross. You want to get that as centered up as possible. And then you just kind of play with the height and width until the angles start to look right. And again, this is one of those situations where, you know, you could be super meticulous and count the number of, the number of boxes over and then the number of boxes up to kind of get the exact slope like we did in, middle school geometry. I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to eyeball it. These aren't necessarily professional applications. We're just trying to create something that looks, realistic for our paint scheme. So now that those are there, I'm going to group them together. I'm not going to keep them grouped together forever, but I'm going to group them together just for the sake of simplicity. And now I'm going to find a nice blue, and that's going to be the blue that we use for our Lowe's logo and the car that we make later. So we're jumping ahead a little bit, and now you can see we've got just two lines formed above the Lowe's logo now. Now we're going to start creating our lettering. And this is another situation where don't get too hung up on how perfect everything looks right now. The lettering is probably the most important thing to get right. So if you notice that your lettering looks good, but it doesn't quite fit the background, don't concern yourself with that right now. The lettering is definitely the harder thing to get right, and so you want to make sure that it's absolutely perfect. We can adjust the shapes of the background later. So I'm noticing with the Lowe's logo here, just the way that the L is aligned, I'm going to start from the outside edge and just kind of count the boxes on my PNG, and then I'm going to count in from there and set my left boundary for my letter L. And we're going to lock that in, and then we're going to do another line that's going to delineate how wide letter L needs to be. This is kind of something that I do just to make sure it sort of feels right by eye before I get started, because again, the lettering is probably the most important thing to make sure you have right. So once I get that sorted out, we've got the upright for the L sort of measured out, and I've got that number in my head, and so now I'm going out and measuring how wide the letter L needs to be altogether, including the tail. And so we're going to set the right edge of that letter, and now we're going to figure out the gap to the letter O next to it. And you're going to see as we go through this entire process that this is something we're doing a lot. We're going to find the spacing, we're going to find the left boundary, we're going to measure how wide the letter is, we're going to set the right boundary, and then we're going to find the gap to the next letter again. And so you're going to have a lot of lines by the time you're done with this, but trust me, it's gonna look really good, and it's gonna help you make sure that everything is perfect. Alright, now you can see we've got the gap to the letter O set. We're gonna move over and we're gonna measure the width of the letter O, and again, we're doing this all based on our PNG. and then we're counting the boxes on our grid system. So again, the lettering is really important to get right. I feel like the lettering is one of the easiest things to get wrong on any particular logo. And so we're going to be super anal about making sure all these spaces are done as well as possible, and we're not going to worry about where they fit on the background. You could do this completely independent of the background. What I'm trying to do here is build the entire logo at once. Again, you'll see at the end where it doesn't quite work out, but it's a good lesson in, not being afraid to make adjustments and kind of going with, trusting yourself and trusting, what you're putting together. So as you can see, we've got all the lettering here outlined. The big gap between the last two letters, that's where there's going to be an apostrophe between the E and the S, so that's why that gap looks a little wonky compared to the others. And now we're going to come through and set our bottom line. Our bottom line is important because this helps set the height versus the width. And again, with lettering being so important, proportions are a big deal. And so making sure that at the very least, when we get this thing started, our lettering is perfect will let us fit everything else around it and know that we've made the right choice. And so now that the bottom line is set, we're going to go through really quickly, and we're going to move on to setting the top of the L, as that's the tallest letter, and then we'll move on and do the lowercase letters afterwards. So now we're sliding up and trying to find the top of the letter L. And again, we're using our PNG grid to measure this out. I'm narrowing this line just so that it only covers the L. This is just going to help me avoid confusion later, and it's going to help me also count, the gaps between the height of the L versus the height of the shorter letters to make sure that proportionally things look like they should. So now that we've got the top of our L set, I'm going to go grab this wide line at the top, and I'm going to narrow it up a little bit, and this is going to be the line we use to line up the tops of all of our lowercase letters. So we're going to slide this over. I think I made it a little bit too narrow. I'm just going to make it a little bit wider. There we go. And so we've counted the number of boxes that this needs to be shorter versus the L. And so now I've got the proportion for all of our letters set out here. And we're going to start very simply by just grabbing a white rectangle, and we're going to start building our lettering. And I'm going to be quiet for this part. You can kind of watch along and see, how this all comes together. I'm not going to explain too much. It's pretty self-explanatory, and you can actually, if you want to, you can just copy some of this stuff down in terms of like the dimensions and things like that. As I'm going, you can pause and whatever as you need to. One thing I forgot to mention is because of the O and the W use rounded corners, we have to actually use these squares to make the corners, because you notice as you elongate the rounded square, the corners get kind of distorted and they end up looking a little bit weird. So we're going to use these rounded squares. They're going to make each corner of the O, and they're going to make the bottom corners of the W, because the top corners of the W are squared. I don't know why they did that, but that's just the font that this is. So yeah, just a quick thing to keep in mind. If you're trying to make rounded corners, the best way to do it is to put a rounded square in the corner and then build some rectangles around it, or into it rather, because if you try to just use the rounded squares to make rectangles, your corners are never going to look as, you know, perfectly rounded as you want them to. Now we're on to my least favorite part, trying to do the S. I'm not going to lie, I cheated with this one. I grabbed a letter. I was hoping I could find something in here that followed the same characteristics as the Lowe's font. Fortunately, the S in here does work for that. I believe it's one of the later... It's one of the later options. I believe it might even be the last one. I've noticed that this S has flat ends, kind of like that, but without the little tails. And so I need something like this lowercase s. Looks like it's going to be just about perfect. And I'm going to compare it to the uppercase, but yeah, the lowercase looks like it's just about perfect. It's going to need a little bit of skew and scale work. And the other thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to make it a little bit more bold. But once we get the width and the height set, you can kind of see like this is pretty close to what we're going to need. So I'm just going to skew it a little bit and then spin it. And just kind of play with the dimensions a little bit until it gets to a place where it feels like it's got the same symmetry as the rest of the letters in the set. Like I said, it's always going to look a little bit funky because it's not the exact same font, but it's one that'll work for us, especially as we go through and we make it layer it to make it bolder. So you can see now I'm moving up, I'm moving down, I'm moving to the left and to the right, and what that's doing is that's filling out this letter to give us that bold look that we need without having to build the entire letter from scratch. Now we're going to get to things later where we have to build the entire letter from scratch, and let me tell you, S's are some of the hardest ones to do, at least for me to get right. But fortunately for this one, we found a letter a letter S that was pretty close to what we needed, and we were able to finagle it and make it work for us. So now I've deleted all the guidelines. I grouped the S together because the S looks pretty good, so we're not going to mess with that. But I haven't grouped the rest of the letters together yet because they don't quite look right. And so the first thing I'm noticing is that this O just feels like it's a little bit too narrow in terms of the width of the actual strokes. The interior is too open, but the outside edges are fine. So we're going to leave the outside parameter alone. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the sides, the uprights, a little bit wider, just to kind of fill in that gap a little bit, because I feel like they're just a little too skinny. And the same is going to be true with the W. You can also see some alignment things. We're going to go through and touch those up as well on the W and the E especially. And as you can see, I'm going through and right now I'm just making the corner piece for the O a little bit wider. Again, as we mentioned, we want to keep the corners as squares so that we keep the nice rounded 90-degree corner up there. But we're just making it a little bit wider, and I'm using the actual background as sort of a scale just to kind of see how much wider I want it to be. And now I feel like we're kind of there. I feel like that's going to be pretty good. So I'm going to drop this back down into place, and I'm just going to basically make everything match it. So once I get this lined up with its top piece and the outside edge and the left, we're going to take everything else and we're just going to make that match. So I'm going to get rid of some of these that I don't want here anymore, and we're going to start using the wider section. We're going to make this a little bit wider right now. So we're going to drop it into the center. We're going to make it a little bit wider. I'm just going to keep playing with it a little bit until we get it to exactly where we want it. And from there we're just going to keep building the shapes to fit this new wider stroke. And so I'm again going to shut up and just kind of let you watch and see how we progress. One thing you'll notice right here is that I actually take this L shape that we've made and I just sort of group it together. I don't really group it together, but I highlight them all together, and then I just copy it and flip it. That's because the O is such a symmetrical shape that we want both sides to be exactly equal. So if we've already built half the shape, then all we have to do is stamp it and rotate it twice, and then just make sure that the edges line up on the new side as well. And we've got our new O. That's looking much better. The gap in the center is much better than it was before, and we're that much closer to having our Lowe's logo really looking the way it should. We're going to take this same stroke width and we're going to copy it over onto the W as well. And that's going to solve some of our alignment problems, but that's also just going to make the W look as full as it does in the real life logo. Now that we've gotten all our letters lined up, it's time to drop in that apostrophe. I didn't do this yet because I wanted to make sure that I got the spacing and everything right before I dropped this in, and just made it one more thing that we had to mess with. So the apostrophe is kind of this tapering rectangle, but it's flat on one side. So we're going to skew it to get the flat side where we want it and get the angled side to be a little bit more pronounced. That's just the way it is on the real life logo. And then we're going to shrink it a little bit because it's a little too big right now, and that's pretty much going to do it. That's going to be it right there. But what you're going to notice is that I'm going to go through and I'm going to group the Lowe's letters together and create a new layer group. So now we've got the Lowe's word mark saved in our design catalog separate from the full logo that we're about to create. We'll be able to use just the word mark, change the color of it, do whatever we want to it, so we can slap it wherever we want to on the car independent of the background logo. And the other thing we'll notice here is that the Lowe's lettering and the Lowe's logo, the actual shadow logo that we created, weren't quite lined up properly and weren't quite scaled properly. That was because I believe I made a mistake in measuring the insides versus the outsides when I was doing all the parameter measurements. So luckily, since this is such a simple shape, this is pretty easy to fix. What I went through and I did is I centered the lettering on the main logo, but I also noticed that the top section just felt a little too tall compared to the rest of it. And when you look at the real life logo, those kickouts weren't as tall as I had made them. So I just went through and I dropped those down, and now we've got a Lowe's logo that looks crisp and clean, and we're ready for an outline. And so when it comes to outlining, it's really simple. All you have to do is you stamp your background shadow and drop it below the main blue shadow that we've got here. And we're going to change the color to white. Obviously, you're not going to be able to see it yet, but the beauty of this is we're going to scale it up a little bit. And that's going to help us kind of set, like, oh, that's too far. But this is going to kind of help us set exactly where we need everything to land. So we've got our width set. I like the way the width looks. The height and the top and the bottom are a little bit narrow, but that's fine. We'll just stamp it and we'll move it up until we get a good, nice, bold white outline on the top, and then we'll stamp it again and we'll move it down, and that's going to finish our outline work on the bottom. And that's it. That's all she wrote. We've created a Lowe's logo from scratch in the Forza Motorsport 7 paint creator. You can also do this in Forza Horizon 4, but I like using Forza Motorsport 7 because I can move these forward into Horizon 4, whereas my Horizon 4 stuff can't go backwards. So that's that, and thank you for watching. Have a good one.